Long before newspapers printed his name in bold black ink, before his crimes painted nightmares across the country, he lived in the shadows of obscurity. He wasn't born with horns. No sulfur trailed behind his steps. To the world, he was just another child. But inside, something was watching. Something waiting. Psychologists today call it latent darkness, a trait that hides under the surface, dormant until the right environment brings it to life. Criminologists call it the invisible seed of psychopathy, the kind that grows silently in cold homes and silent dinners, where punishment replaces conversation, and the only affection is absence. The story of H.H. Holmes didn't begin with blood. It began with silence. And silence, in the right kind of mind, is louder than screams. His name was Herman Webster Mudgett, born May 16, 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, a town so still, even the wind seemed to whisper instead of howl. Nestled in the woods of New England, Gilmanton was more than just a dot on the map. It was a place where history hung heavy in the air, where old Puritan beliefs hadn't yet faded, a place untouched by progress, where church bells rang louder than laughter. People in Gilmanton didn't ask questions. They didn't visit unannounced. Doors were kept closed, voices low, and judgment high. To outsiders, it might have looked peaceful, but to those who lived there, it was a town woven together by quiet repression, by rules never spoken, and pain never admitted. And young Herman, he breathed it in like oxygen. The cold, the quiet, the careful distance between people. It shaped him, not with love, but with absence. Psychological studies today refer to such environments as emotional deserts, places that don't nurture children, they withhold them. And children raised in deserts, they don't grow roots, they grow armor. And young Herman, he learned early that emotions were dangerous, that feelings were things best hidden, buried under silence and stillness, like bones beneath a frozen field. No one taught him how to cry. No one told him it was safe to feel afraid, or hurt, or small. So he didn't. He watched. He listened. He copied faces but never emotions. From a young age, he developed what modern developmental psychologists call masking, a defense mechanism where children suppress their real feelings to match what the world wants to see. Herman became a master of it. He smiled when expected, spoke softly, did his chores, but inside, he was a vault, a sealed chamber of unexpressed thoughts, of fears turned inward, of rage with no release. Experts in child psychopathology often warn, when children aren't allowed to express pain, that pain doesn't disappear. It just finds other ways to live. In Herman's case, it lived quietly in the background, waiting for the day it would no longer hide. His father, Levi Horton Mudgett, was a man of labor and liquor. He worked hard when he had to, drank harder when he didn't. His temper wasn't a storm, it was a strike of lightning, sudden, sharp, no warning. To Levi, discipline meant control, and control came through the belt, through silence enforced by bruises. He believed fear was respect, that a child who obeyed out of terror was a child properly raised. There were no bedtime stories, no, "I'm proud of you, son." Only the slow unbuckling of leather when a glass was emptied, or a look was wrong, or a voice too loud. And then there was his mother, Theodate Price, pious, cold, a woman who clutched her Bible closer than her children. To her, suffering was spiritual. Pain was purification, and love, if it ever existed, was meant only for God. She would sit for hours in silence, her lips moving in prayer, her back turned to her crying son. Childhood trauma experts speak of emotional abandonment, where a child's need for connection is met with indifference. But Herman? He didn't just grow up unseen. He grew up unwanted. Caught between fists and faith, he learned to expect neither comfort nor compassion, only control, only correction. It's said that children form their view of the world through their parents. So what does a child learn when his father is violence and his mother is absence? He learns that the world isn't to be loved, it's to be controlled. And someday, he'd control it in ways no one could imagine. He grew up with dead eyes, not dull, but empty. The kind of eyes that look at people, but never into them. Herman didn't throw tantrums. He didn't cry. He didn't laugh like other boys. Instead, he watched, always watched, as if the world were an experiment, and he was the only one aware he was in the lab. His mind was sharp, too sharp for his age. He read early, solved puzzles easily, but it wasn't the games that fascinated him. It was the endings. He wanted to know what came after pain, what happened when the lights went out, not in a room, but in a person. Modern forensic psychologists now describe this as death-focused curiosity, a rare but dangerous pattern in developing minds. Not a fear of death, but a fascination with it, a desire to understand it, even interact with it. Herman began asking questions no child should ask. How long until something rots? Why do dead animals stiffen? Where does the soul go if it goes anywhere at all? He'd find dead birds and hold them like puzzles, not mourning them, studying them. He didn't see tragedy, he saw structure. Studies in criminal pathology show that many serial killers begin life with this same trait, not cruelty, but clinical detachment. Herman didn't kill for fun, not yet, but he was already learning something chilling. Life ends, but the body remains, and that body can be used. One gray afternoon, a group of local boys devised a prank. The kind boys think is harmless, but years later, people would wonder if that day planted something deeper. They dared young Herman to enter the town doctor's office, not to steal, not to vandalize, but to face what every child feared, the skeleton. In that dusty back room, behind cabinets of rusted instruments, stood a tall, yellowing human skeleton, strung together by wire, lit by a cracked window, watching silently for decades. The boys shoved Herman forward. They expected him to cry, to run, to collapse into the fear every child carries of death given form. But Herman didn't flinch. He stepped forward, slowly, drawn in by something only he could feel. He stared at the hollow eye sockets, touched the rib cage like it was a harp, let his fingers rest on the mandible, and then he smiled. Not a playful grin, not a boyish laugh, but a cold, still curve of the lips, like he just found something familiar. Criminal psychologists now say this moment was not a test of fear, but a window into emotional detachment. When fear is absent and fascination takes its place, you're no longer dealing with a normal developmental path. That skeleton didn't scare him. It called to him. It wasn't a symbol of death. It was a blueprint, a human body stripped of identity, just pieces, waiting to be understood and maybe reused. This wasn't the moment Herman became a killer, but it was the moment death stopped being foreign. And once death becomes familiar, nothing else feels sacred. As Herman grew older, he did what many young men from rural towns dream of. He went to school. Prestigious ones. First, Phillips Exeter Academy, a place for the elite. Then the University of Michigan Medical School, where he studied not only anatomy, but opportunity. To his professors, he was quiet, well-mannered, attentive. To classmates, polite, if a little strange. But behind his eyes, Herman wasn't just learning how to treat the human body. He was learning how to profit from it. In the dissection labs, he became familiar with the dead. Too familiar. He practiced on cadavers the way an artist sketches rough drafts. With confidence, with precision, with no reverence. He learned how to flay a body clean, how to drain it, preserve it, disguise it, how to erase identity, turning a life into a legal formality. Criminal forensic specialists would later call this instrumental detachment, the ability to use a body not as a human being, but as a tool. Soon, bodies began to go missing, unclaimed, unnoticed. But their stories didn't end there. Herman began taking out life insurance policies on people who didn't exist, or on people who would soon, accidentally, die. He'd file under a fake name, submit the paperwork, then present a corpse, mangled just enough to be tragic, but intact enough to be claimed. The death was always just believable enough. The payout, substantial. No one questioned the calm young man in the black coat. No one suspected the polite medical student of fraud. Why would they? He spoke well, dressed well, smiled often. But behind that smile was a man who saw every corpse as a check waiting to clear. He wasn't just studying medicine, he was perfecting the business of death. At the University of Michigan, Herman learned more than anatomy and insurance fraud. He discovered the power of charm. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it worked. He didn't overpower people, he read them. He watched how women blushed when complimented, how men relaxed when called sir, how professors softened when a student agreed too eagerly. He noticed things, like how people want to feel admired, how they trust a calm voice, how they believe what they want to believe. Behavioral criminologists refer to this as mirroring manipulation. It's when a person reflects back the ideal version of someone, not to connect, but to control. Herman used it fluently. He told women what they longed to hear. He sold promises he never meant to keep. He invented credentials, borrowed names, wrote letters with elegant lies. He didn't take what he wanted, he made you give it to him. No yelling, no threats, just a tilt of the head, a slow smile, a look that said, "You can trust me." People called him polite, well-spoken, educated, promising. But behind the courtesy was a predator wearing a tailored mask. He was a perfect mirror. He made you feel seen, until one day you realized you'd been looking at a reflection with no soul behind it. Eventually, Herman vanished. No headlines, no missing posters, just gone. He left Michigan, left his classmates, his false identities, and most importantly, he left the name Mudgett behind. It wasn't just a change of name, it was a ritual shedding of skin. In psychological terms, experts call this identity rebirth, a process by which certain individuals, especially those with antisocial personality traits, discard their past entirely to construct a new, controlled version of reality. And Herman did just that. He arrived in Chicago, the bustling, growing city of industry, of immigrants and ambition, a city where people came to reinvent themselves, where no one asked where you came from, only what you could offer. It was the perfect hiding place, or rather the perfect breeding ground. And there he was born again, not as a boy from New Hampshire, not as a student, not even as a man with a history, but as a doctor, a pharmacist, a trusted member of society, a new man with a new name, H. Holmes. Sharp, clean, authoritative. A name that meant nothing at the time, but would one day come to mean death. In Chicago, H. Holmes began building his new life, brick by brick, lie by lie. He told people he was a doctor of chemistry, a trained pharmacist, an expert in anatomy and healing. He opened a drugstore, wore clean suits, spoke with confidence, made eye contact, smiled. People trusted him, women adored him, landlords gave him credit, patients gave him their bodies. In a city full of strangers, Holmes became familiar, respected. He was always polite, always soft-spoken, always helpful. And behind that smile, a darkness sharpened daily. Criminal profilers often describe this phase as the camouflage stage. It's when dangerous individuals build a social mask so complete, even their victims don't see the knife coming until it's already inside them. Holmes didn't rush. He studied the game. He laid foundations. He observed weaknesses, financial, emotional, social. He took mental notes. He drew mental maps. And while the city saw a young professional on the rise, he was sketching something far more sinister, something no city had ever seen. Some say evil is born, a curse in the blood, a fracture in the soul from the first breath. Others say it's made, that pain and neglect, repeated long enough, can carve innocence into something monstrous. But with Holmes, it wasn't birth. And it wasn't a single moment of becoming, it was evolution. Quiet, patient, deliberate. A kind smile, a well-fitted suit, a handshake so firm it felt like trust. And behind it, a void. A devil was walking among men, smiling, charming, buying bricks, collecting blueprints, measuring walls. And no one suspected a thing. Not yet. Who was Herman? Who was Holmes? Two names, two lives, one body, split by choice. Herman Webster Mudgett was the boy who disappeared. No obituary, no farewell, just gone. In his place stood a name, sharp, simple, sinister, H.H. Holmes. A ghost tailored in suits, a smile too clean, a past too empty. He abandoned everything, family, friends, even the mirror. What stepped forward wasn't Herman in disguise. It was something else entirely. He didn't run from the past, he erased it. And what remained was precision, a mind cold as steel, a heart hollowed by ambition. He wasn't escaping, he was becoming. Not a man, but a method. And soon, the world would know his name. Not in memory, but in fear. The devil was never born. He was constructed. Chicago. In the 1880s, it was a city on fire. Not literally, not anymore. But in ambition, in noise, in dreams, rising faster than its smokestacks. It was a place where people disappeared, and no one asked why. Factories hummed, streets pulsed. Opportunity smelled like coal and sweat. Everyone was someone new. Everyone was pretending. To Holmes, it wasn't just a city. It was camouflage, a perfect maze of strangers, all too busy chasing their own escape. He found a boarding house, changed his story, his name, his past. To some, he was a doctor. To others, a gentleman from the East. To all, he was no one real. Here he could vanish in the crowd, reinvent himself with every handshake, lie with a smile, kill with a bow. No one knew who he was, and that was exactly what he wanted. He called himself a doctor, sometimes a pharmacist, sometimes both. Credentials, forged. References, invented. But no one questioned him. Why would they? He was polite, well-spoken, educated, promising. He wore a suit, not a stain. He smiled when he spoke. He paid his rent on time. In a world desperate for decency, he looked like the answer. He set up shop in a pharmacy, sold remedies, gave advice, listened with interest. But it wasn't healing he offered. It was illusion. Every word rehearsed, every gesture calculated. He wasn't just hiding the truth. He was performing trust, and the world applauded. Words were his favorite weapon. Not guns, not fists, not even poison. Just sentences, crafted like scalpels. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he listened. And when he spoke, it was always exactly enough. A compliment here, a thoughtful pause there, a perfectly timed "I understand." People believed him because he made them feel seen, understood, important. He mimicked empathy, rehearsed eye contact, measured smiles, and every gesture, from the way he tilted his head to the way he folded his hands, was scripted. He didn't lie with facts, he lied with rhythm, tone, timing. Holmes didn't force doors open, he made people open them themselves, smiling all the while as they let the devil in. Trust was currency, and Holmes knew how to earn it and spend it recklessly. He didn't need force, he needed belief. A warm introduction, a steady handshake, a gaze that held yours just long enough. Soon he had what most men begged for: credit, contracts, commitments. He borrowed money he never intended to return, rented spaces he'd never pay for, ordered goods under names that didn't exist. Women adored him, men respected him, landlords welcomed him, investors bet on him. He built a reputation like a fortress, one polite word at a time. And once they trusted him, he took what he needed, then vanished. He didn't trick people into giving, he made them want to. That was the brilliance. That was the danger. He didn't steal trust, he cultivated it. And when the time was right, he cashed it in. One name was never enough. Not for a man like Holmes. He wore identities like costumes, each one tailored for a different scene. To the banker, he was Dr. H. Holmes. To the landlord, Henry Gordon. To the woman in room 12, Alexander Bond. To the pharmacist across town, no name, just a smile. He forged letters, wrote glowing reviews of himself, signed contracts as men who never existed. But this wasn't just fraud, it was theater, a web of names that spoke for each other, so no one ever saw the full man, only the part he wanted them to see. And when it all fell apart, there were no fingerprints, just a curtain, and behind it, no one at all. It looked like a hotel, but it wasn't. It started with a plot of land, a corner lot on 63rd and Wallace in Chicago, prime real estate. Holmes signed the lease with charm, not money. Then came the blueprints, not by one architect, but several, fired in sequence, so no one saw the full plan. He hired crews, paid in installments, fired them halfway through, hired new ones, fired them too. He told each man a different story, a pharmacy, a hotel, a private home, all of them true, and none of them complete. Walls went up, but doors led to nowhere. Staircases ended abruptly. Rooms were built without windows, some without exits. He ordered materials in other names, had furniture delivered to rooms no one rented, installed chutes that led somewhere. From the outside, impressive. From the inside, confusing. From the blueprint in his head, deadly. It wasn't just a building, it was a system, a trap disguised as comfort, a theater built for one role, hunter, and every brick laid was a whisper, no one will find them here. Some rooms had no doors, some had no windows, some had both, then vanished overnight. There were staircases that led to ceilings, hallways that ended in brick walls, closets too small for clothes, but just the right size for something else. Why? No one knew, and no one asked, because Holmes was charming, because the building was beautiful, because confusion, when delivered politely, becomes curiosity, not suspicion. He called them guest rooms, but guests didn't stay long, and sometimes they were never seen again. One room was lined with iron plates, another had gas lines hidden in the walls. Some were soundproofed, some locked only from the outside. Each design had a reason. Each feature served a purpose, not for comfort, for control. It was a hotel built like a puzzle, one only Holmes could solve, and sometimes he didn't need to. Sometimes the rooms did the work for him. All he had to do was close the door. He never kept a crew for long. That was the plan. Each team built a piece, a wall, a room, a staircase to nowhere. Then he'd fire them, no warning, no explanation, just gone. And when the next crew arrived, they saw what was already built, and never questioned why it made no sense. Holmes played the role well. He was calm, charming, paid just enough to delay suspicion, never enough to keep loyalty. He claimed changes in the plan, conflicting instructions, lost permits, anything to justify the confusion. But the truth was simple. No one could know the whole structure. No one could see the full design, because no one ever stayed long enough. One builder remembered a room with no windows. Another remembered a hallway that led to a dead end. Neither knew the other existed. That was the genius. The design was fragmented on purpose, not to save money, but to bury intent. And by the time anyone started asking questions, the bricks were set, the staircases built, the secrets locked behind finished walls. When does a man stop fearing the law? When he learns he can bend it, and no one bends it back. Holmes didn't seize power with force. He whispered and watched the world rearrange itself. No threats, no weapons, just words, measured, calculated, surgical. He began with small things, convincing a banker to extend credit, a landlord to waive rent, a woman to follow him into the dark. It worked, every time. So he raised the stakes, forged documents with confidence, lied under oath without blinking, stared into the eyes of good men, and made them believe he was better. And when no hand stopped him, when no badge questioned him, he understood something terrible. He wasn't just avoiding consequences, he was creating the rules. People obeyed not because they were weak, but because he made them feel seen, needed, safe. And when they stepped too close, he didn't push them. He smiled and let gravity do the rest. Holmes didn't test power in public. He tested it in whispers, in signatures, in the slow, invisible erosion of doubt. From man to myth to god of his own small kingdom. Not with miracles, but with mastery. And behind his eyes, there was no fire, no joy, just the cold silence of someone who had learned that control was divine. They called it an accident, a tragedy, nothing more. A young woman, alone, unlucky, in the wrong place at the wrong time. But something didn't fit. Holmes had just met her, charming, of course, attentive, promising her help, opportunity, maybe more. She was last seen entering his pharmacy, smiling, alive, then gone. No blood, no scream, just absence. Holmes told a story naturally. She left town. Family troubles. He wished her well. No one questioned him. Why would they? He was polite, respected, a gentleman. And she? Just a girl. Another face in the city. But some whispered, not loudly, just enough. That her letters stopped, that her belongings stayed behind, that Holmes grew quieter and colder. Was it a mistake, an accident, or something else? A test maybe, a rehearsal, a line crossed carefully. If this was his first kill, it didn't feel like one. There was no panic, no cover-up, only silence, as if he had done it before, as if he had always known that death could be clean, controlled, invisible. She may have been the first, but she would not be the last. And Holmes, he didn't stop. He grew more confident, more precise, more invisible. Because power is addictive, and murder, even more so when you get away with it. For most people, death is the end. For Holmes, it was just the beginning. Of paperwork, of profits, of power. He studied the system. Every clause in an insurance policy, every loophole in the legal code. He knew the dead couldn't argue, and the living rarely asked the right questions. He took out policies on strangers, sometimes on lovers, sometimes on people who didn't even exist. He forged signatures, created fake identities, filed claims before the bodies were cold, sometimes before the bodies even existed. A corpse wasn't a tragedy to Holmes, it was a transaction, the value of flesh measured in numbers and ink. He staged accidents, disguised murders as disappearances, swapped bodies like cards in a deck. The more he manipulated the system, the more he realized death wasn't his enemy, it was his business partner. Each payout gave him more than money, it gave him confidence. Proof that he could control life and death with a pen, with a plan, with a perfectly timed lie. He wasn't killing for rage, or lust, or revenge. He was killing for return on investment. In a world full of rules, Holmes didn't break them. He rewrote them, one death certificate at a time. The pharmacy was just the beginning. A storefront, a smile, a place where trust was brewed like medicine. But Holmes wanted more. So, he expanded. Across the street, he built a hotel. At least, that's what the sign said. To guests, it looked like opportunity. To Holmes, it was something else entirely. A maze, a trap, a business plan written in blood. He didn't just rent rooms, he designed them. Each floor a puzzle, each hallway a decision. Some doors locked from the outside, some rooms had no windows, some hallways led nowhere. And all the while, business thrived. Tourists checked in, employees worked behind counters, money changed hands. And beneath it all, Holmes operated in the shadows. He ordered supplies under fake names, installed hidden chutes, built kilns, prepared basements no guest would ever see. He turned commerce into camouflage, profit into performance, hospitality into a hunting ground. To the world, he was a successful entrepreneur, well-dressed, well-spoken, well-liked. But behind every smile was structure, a system, because this wasn't just a business, it was a mechanism. And every customer, every employee, every handshake was just another cog in the machine. A machine Holmes built to feed his appetite and hide it in plain sight. He smiled in public, tipped his hat, held doors open, paid his bills. Holmes didn't hide in shadows, he thrived in sunlight. People saw what they wanted, a respectable man, educated, charming, successful, and so they stopped looking deeper. The police had no complaints, the papers had no questions, the neighbors had no courage. Behind the walls, locked rooms, false floors, secrets. But outside, warm greetings, laughter, polite conversation. Trust covered him like a coat, thick enough to silence suspicion, clean enough to blind judgment. He walked among them, unhindered, untouched, unexamined. Because when the eyes don't see, the heart doesn't ask. And when no one asks, the darkness spreads, unchecked, unchallenged, unstoppable. Holmes didn't need to escape the law. He only needed it to look the other way. And it did, again and again. While beneath the floorboards and behind the hotel doors, a new world was growing, piece by piece, body by body. The more they trusted him, the deeper the rot grew. And by the time anyone looked back, the light was already gone. The blueprints were no longer on paper. They stood 3 stories tall, brick and steel, locks and levers. A castle, not for royalty, but for ruin. Holmes called it a hotel, a place of comfort, of opportunity. But inside, there were rooms that no guest would ever check out from, chutes that led nowhere but down, walls that listened, and doors that only opened one way. The construction was complete, the lies polished, the rooms furnished, the exits sealed. Holmes didn't rush, he waited, perfected, prepared. This was no ordinary building. It was a machine, one designed to kill quietly, efficiently, without witness. And now, it was ready. All it needed was motion. A single guest, a single mistake, a single knock at the door. Holmes stood at the center of it all, calm, smiling, listening to the silence his castle breathed. He had built the stage, cast the roles, written the ending. All that remained was to begin. But that story, the real story, is just getting started. All it needed was motion. A single guest, a single mistake, a single knock at the door. The castle was quiet, too quiet. It didn't hum, it didn't creak, it waited. It didn't need to go outside to hunt. It only needed one thing, someone to walk in. The castle didn't chase, it invited. She wasn't running from anyone. She wasn't scared. She just needed a room. And he needed a name to erase. She signed the book at 8:47 p.m. Clara L. 1 bag, paid for 2 nights. She smiled. At the man behind the desk, he smiled back. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. And so it began. The system, the silence, the castle had opened its mouth. She had just turned 22. A suitcase, a train ticket, and a resume folded neatly in her coat pocket. Chicago was supposed to be the beginning. A better job, a bigger life, a new city where no one knew her past. And that morning, she smiled at the sun. She had hope. She had plans. She had no idea that something had already chosen her. The castle didn't care about dreams. It didn't care about hope. It only cared that she walked through the door. And the man behind the front desk? He didn't blink. He wore a suit that didn't wrinkle, spoke like a gentleman, held doors open, poured tea, smiled softly. But he never once looked her in the eyes, only her neck. He asked kind questions, offered her a room, said he might even have a job for her, if she was interested. She was. Why wouldn't she be? He was charming, polite, safe, the kind of man parents hoped their daughters would meet. She thought she was lucky. She thought this was her chance. But luck doesn't knock, and neither do predators. They open the door and wait. She wasn't the first girl to walk through that door, not even close. She was just the first one we ever learned the name of. Clara. He remembered it. He always remembered the names, not because he cared, because trophies need labels. There were staircases that led nowhere, doors that locked from the outside, and behind the wallpaper, hollow walls. It looked like a hotel, but it wasn't. The castle didn't breathe, it pulsed. With each hallway, it whispered misdirection. Every step deeper led further from safety. There were rooms without windows, rooms with 5 doors, but only one that opened. Rooms where the floor tilted just enough to guide a body in one direction. There were staircases that rose to ceilings, staircases that ended midair. Some built to confuse, others built to trap. And behind the walls, air pockets, hollow voids big enough to crawl through or hide something. Holmes called them storage, but no guest ever saw what they stored. Doors locked from the outside, peepholes from one side only, walls stuffed with insulation, not for heat, but for silence. Even the wallpaper had a purpose. It covered seams, it erased lines. No blueprint matched the real thing. Because Holmes didn't follow design, he followed instinct. He didn't build a hotel, he built a system. And he tested every inch of it, not for comfort, but for control. Some rooms were soundproof, others airtight. All of them were his. From the first nail to the last brick, he made sure of one thing. Once you walked in, there was no way out, not unless he wanted there to be. Holmes didn't build a building. He built a system that inhaled trust and exhaled silence. He tested everything. Gas valves hidden behind walls, doors that closed themselves, vents that didn't lead outside, only deeper in. He timed the airflow, measured how long screams took to fade, refined the angles, tightened the seals. No room echoed, no corridor carried sound. He added bricks, insulation, empty space, not for comfort, for control. The castle didn't welcome guests, it absorbed them. Holmes didn't chase, he didn't shout, he waited, while the castle did the work. Because it wasn't just a hotel, it was a machine, and he was the engineer. She screamed once, maybe twice, but no one heard, because he built it that way. Clara stepped inside. The door closed behind her by itself. It didn't slam, it clicked. She turned to unpack and paused. There was no window, no vent, no draft under the door. Just a strange stillness, a silence that didn't feel quiet, but watched. She tried the handle, locked. Of course, the light stayed on, the air was clean, the room was neat, almost too neat. She took one step back, and that's when it began. Maybe it was gas, maybe a hidden latch, no one knows for sure. There was a sound, soft, mechanical, then a sudden weightlessness, and Clara was gone. No exit, no trace, not even a question. Because in Holmes's castle, disappearances weren't mistakes, they were part of the design. Down there, names stopped mattering, bones turned to dust. The only thing that stayed was his routine. The basement wasn't a place, it was a process. Thick brick walls, no sound in, no sound out, no clocks, no footsteps, just the hum of something always running. A table, steel, stained, steady, not designed for comfort, designed for stillness. A vat of acid in the corner, a drain in the floor, labels, tools, hooks. Everything had a purpose, and none of it was random. He took notes, not names, measurements, rates of decay, weight loss per hour. He recorded time, but never memory. No prayers, no rituals, only precision. He didn't scream, didn't rush, he didn't need to. The castle was doing exactly what it was built to do. Sometimes, he kept a piece, an earring, a button, a lock of hair, sealed in a jar, labeled, stored, because he always remembered the names, not out of guilt, but because trophies need labels. And in that basement, voices died, memories dissolved, and the silence didn't just linger, it replaced everything. He worked slowly, deliberately, like a man cleaning up after dinner, not after death. The room was scrubbed, the sheets replaced, mattress burned. No one knocked, no one asked. He waited until nightfall, then carried what was left to the basement, piece by piece, wrapped, labeled. The skeleton? It was boiled clean, bleached white, then sold to a nearby medical school. Cash only, no questions. Just another specimen. No name, no history, no family. And what he didn't sell, he kept. A pair of earrings, delicate, silver, still warm when he touched them. He placed them in a box, beside a lock of hair, a photograph, a name written carefully beneath. Clara. Not because he missed her, but because even monsters like to keep score. It didn't creak, it didn't crack, it didn't fail. It worked. Every bolt, every wall, every lie. He walked the hallways like a surgeon before the cut, not to reflect, but to inspect. He counted every step, slow, measured, surgical. Hinges opened on cue. The lights blinked on like stage curtains rising. The doors clicked shut, like the end of a sentence. The vents swallowed sound. And the walls never whispered a thing. No screams, no witnesses, no evidence. Not a single room out of place. Not a single question asked. He changed his gloves, reset the clocks, burned what was left of the bed sheets. Then he smiled, not with joy, but like a man who'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in silence. This wasn't improvisation. It wasn't a mistake. It was a trial run. And it worked. The sign said, "Rooms available, clean sheets, hot water, privacy." And people came. Salesmen, secretaries, travelers with no one waiting for them. Holmes didn't take deposits, didn't ask for references. He asked where they were coming from, but never where they were going. He smiled when they checked in, never when they checked out. He chose the ones no one would miss, the invisible, the unmentioned, the ones who didn't send postcards and no longer expected any. No address, no calendar, just a name that would never be spoken again. And if they ever asked about the locked doors or the odd smell from the vents, he'd laugh, offer them tea, say something charming, and blame the old building. They'd nod, feel silly, go back to their rooms. He watched them go and wondered how long until someone asked questions. But no one did, no one ever did. And then the castle closed its mouth again. One more guest inside, one fewer in the world. Chicago was growing, fast, loud, and far too busy to notice anything disappear. The World's Fair was coming. Thousands arrived by train every week. Hotels overflowed. People slept on benches, in basements, under stairs. No one looked twice at Holmes's sign, "Rooms available." He didn't advertise, didn't raise prices. He didn't need to. He had something better than location. He had anonymity. They came to him. Secretaries between jobs, traveling salesmen, young men with nowhere to go, women chasing something better. They stepped off the train, into the noise, and vanished into it. Holmes smiled when they checked in, never when they checked out. He didn't take deposits, didn't ask for ID, just a name, which he never remembered. But he remembered their faces, their shoes, the sound their voices made before they went quiet. Police were overwhelmed. Families waited weeks before writing. Some never did. People vanished, and Chicago kept moving. Because in a city overflowing with strangers, what's one more missing name? To Holmes, it wasn't a crisis. It was business, and business was booming. He kept building, not for comfort, not for guests, but for silence. He hired new crews, different names, different weeks. No one stayed long enough to ask questions or to realize they were building a cage. He changed the angles, bent the air, buried vents inside walls, poured bricks into places where light once passed. Rooms shrank, doors vanished, stairs began and ended in concrete. This wasn't expansion, it was calibration. Each upgrade made the castle less like a hotel and more like a machine. A machine with no maps, no plans, just intention. Every brick, a lie. Every duct, a whisper. And every room, a place to vanish without a sound. Because the castle wasn't made to house the living. It was built to erase the fact they'd ever been there at all. It wasn't built to welcome. It didn't comfort, didn't protect. It calculated. Each wall measured, each vent positioned. Each step through the hallway was part of a process. Because this wasn't a hotel, it was a machine. A machine that didn't sleep, didn't slow down, didn't stop. Guests didn't rest here. They were processed, efficiently, quietly, without witnesses, without waste. Outside, the lights glowed soft and gold, warm enough to invite. But inside, the castle pulsed. And from the third-floor balcony, he watched the street in silence. Not hunting, just waiting. Because once the machine was built, it only needed one thing to keep running: more names. There were no alarms, no screams, no evidence. Just a name in the guest book, Clara L. No one came looking. No one knew she was missing. And the man behind the desk, still smiling, still polite, still asking if you'd like a room for 2 nights. Because Clara wasn't the first, and she was never meant to be the last. The castle didn't stop with her. It kept going, room by room, name by name, quietly. And outside, another train arrives. Another suitcase hits the pavement. Another young woman walks up the steps and reaches for the door. The bell chimes, the lock clicks. Holmes looks up and smiles. Because the system worked, because the machine was ready, because the next guest had just arrived. To hide a crime, you don't erase it. You bury it under something louder. The World's Fair glows in amber light, brass bands, barkers, cobblestones catching the slow glitter of a wheel. The camera drifts through laughter and finds Holmes, not rushing, not playing, just a thin line of a smile, eyes locked on a man in a gray overcoat. A police officer passes. Holmes nods, polite, but the gaze never wavers. Music thins under the groan of the Ferris wheel. Holmes moves with the crowd's pulse, so perfectly you'd miss him, until you look back and he's already there. He arrived with ledgers, red circles bleeding around numbers that only favored Holmes. Where did the money go? Holmes didn't answer. A pencil rolled beneath his thumb, ticking once, twice, then still. Outside, the hollow beat of hammer to wood. Inside, silence stretching, tightening, like wire pulled too far. The man pushed back his chair. The scrape lingered. The clerk at the door looked up. Doubt flared, then cooled. Holmes lowered his eyes to the page, turned it slowly, as if the visitor was already history. When he looked up again, no smile, only the slow closing of his eyelids, and the return of breath. Holmes suggested a meeting at the castle. Come by, we'll go over the plans. A faint nod, a quick handshake. They walked the corridor, gaslight pooling in warm circles, shadows stretching long between them. Midway, Holmes shifted half a step, enough to block the view of a mason smoothing fresh plaster, the rasp of the trowel, the dry grit in the air, the muffled tamp of a blade. All gone the moment Holmes filled the frame. "This way," he murmured, low, courteous, almost casual. The man followed, eyes fixed on the back leading him forward, never seeing the passage narrowing behind. And once it did, there was no turning back. Doors don't have to slam to keep someone in. Sometimes, a whisper is enough. Holmes opened to a room still breathing. The sour sweet of paint and damp plaster. The man stepped inside. The door eased shut with a soft click. From the hall, "Tea?" Holmes didn't turn. No. The air grew heavier. The gas lamp on the wall trembled, as though the room remembered its purpose. Holmes moved to the corner, hands folded behind his back, eyes steady, waiting. You don't kill the body first. You kill their awareness. Sweetness in the air, mint and something quieter, curling like harmless fog. The man breathed in, paused. "What's that smell?" Holmes didn't blink. Fresh paint, masking the walls. A frown, fingers to temple, breathing slower, blink rate falling, pupils widening. In the quiet, the soft tick of a pocket watch, each beat closer than the last. Breath stuttered. A searching hand slid along the table's edge. Holmes tilted his head, watching the last line of a formula. Then, a metallic click. Knees unlocked, the body folded into the chair. No cry, no struggle, only mint in the weak light, refusing to leave. Dead bodies make noise, not with sound, but with suspicion. He moved fast, hands steady, breath measured, like a craftsman finishing a commission. No one ordered. Timber ribs waited in the frame. Wet mortar lay in the trough, heavy as unspoken words. A brick slid into place, another followed. The scrape of steel teeth on stone, the soft crush of grit beneath the blade. Footsteps entered the corridor, slow, counting. Holmes never turned. His palm pressed the face of the wall, as if feeling for a pulse, and deciding it was better gone. By the time the steps paused at the door, there was nothing to see, only the dry breath of lime, thin as dust shaken from a coat, almost like the wall had just eaten. When suspicion knocks, you open before it forces the door. The latch turned, a worker stepped in, boots whispering damp against the boards. His gaze began to wander. Holmes flowed into his sightline, blocking what should never be seen. He gestured downward, tone clipped, faintly annoyed. "Careful, wet paint." The man's eyes dropped, a muttered apology. 2 steps back, the door side shut. Holmes stayed still. 1 beat, 2, then let out the breath he'd been holding. Like smoke leaking from a crack, no one would ever notice. The dead don't stay dead if their papers say otherwise. A desk, a single sheet, pale as winter skin, ink pooling, dark as a bruise. Holmes leaned in, strokes slow, deliberate. Names appeared, belonging to those already gone. Shares drifted, fortunes realigned. History bent, at the wrist of his hand. Then, the seal, heavy, cold, pressed with a dull, final thud. No smear, no hesitation. A perfect red circle, quietly teaching the dead to breathe. And once they did, they were his, to command. A lie needs a voice, preferably not your own. The witness leaned forward, hands folded. "I saw him," she said, "at the station, evening train." Her voice held steady until the next question. What was he wearing? A pause, thick in the air. Behind her, Holmes shifted, one soft cough. Her eyes cleared, a gray overcoat and a black hat. The badge nodded, the pen moved. Holmes leaned back, saying nothing. And in the quiet, the truth had already been replaced. If someone suspects you, give them a better villain. Holmes pitched his voice for the uniform 2 steps away. Poor man, cleaned out by a swindler in St. Louis, couldn't face the shame, ran before creditors found him. The officer stilled, listening, studying Holmes like a nearly solved problem. Holmes met the gaze, steady, unblinking. Silence thinned, then broke. The officer looked down, as if the answer lived in his notes. Holmes's shoulders eased, barely. The moment passed, like a shadow. No one noticed, and in that shadow, the truth stayed hidden. Objects remember their owners, unless you give them a new one. Dust, cold metal, shelves lined with finished stories. Holmes set the gold watch on the counter, its chain coiled slow, almost asleep. Then, the wedding band. One spin, a brief catch of light, then still. Found them at the station, he said. Quick, certain, no space for doubt. The pawnbroker studied him, then slid both away, a faint clink as the drawer shut. And just like that, their story belonged to someone else. Someone who would never know. Someone who could be next. In the right hands, smoke hides the truth, and mirrors can make a new one. Dim light, a silver mirror, hazed by curling smoke. Holmes wiped, slow, careful strokes. The mist thinned, his face surfaced. Calm, unblinking, but a crack split the glass. In the broken line, the reflection bent, twisted, almost inhuman. Holmes leaned toward it, studying, a stranger. And in that hush, it was no longer clear which face wore the lie. In this castle, even the truth learns to lie. Holmes stood in the dark. Behind him, fresh work settling, mortar breathing faint mineral heat. His shadow stretched long across the boards, reaching toward the threshold. He didn't move, didn't blink, listening, as if the wall itself were trying not to be heard. Beyond the bricks, silence lay across something that should have been making noise. Two fingers rested lightly on the doorframe, like closing a book no one would ever open again. The gaslight flickered once and died. In Holmes's castle, a man could die in the afternoon, and by nightfall, he never existed. The room held its breath. No creak, no echo, only the faint hush of paint sealing what lay beneath. The wall stood smooth, skin pale, flawless. Holmes knelt. One last pass of the cloth, erasing a glint no one else would have seen. He folded the rag, tucked it away, as if locking the memory itself. The door closed, the latch fell, soft as settling dust. Outside, the corridor waited, patient, ordinary. Inside, the truth slept, in a place no one would ever think to look. By morning, the castle would forget, and the world would follow. In the beginning, it felt like nothing had changed. The murder castle still breathed as it always did. Silent corridors, hidden rooms, locks that turned by themselves. But beneath the surface, something had started to shift. Small things, a bill left unpaid, a ledger placed in the wrong drawer, a shipment of supplies that never arrived, though money had already changed hands. Holmes still moved through the building with his usual precision. But every now and then his hand paused, as if his mind had drifted, for a single flicker, somewhere darker than even the castle itself. Rumors grew. A shopkeeper whispered that Holmes seemed unusually distracted. A maid claimed she heard a door slam in a room that should have been empty. No one could point to one single thing, but something, somewhere, had begun to crack. And when a structure is built on secrets, even the smallest crack can become the beginning of collapse. For years, everything had moved like clockwork. Holmes didn't simply operate the castle, he conducted it, like a quiet, unseen orchestra. Rooms were prepared, victims entered, evidence disappeared, all without a single misplaced step. But now, the rhythm faltered. One night, Holmes forgot to lock a service door behind him. The next morning, a delivery man found it slightly ajar and hesitated before walking away. Holmes blamed exhaustion, yet even he could feel it, the margin for error shrinking, tightening around him like a noose. He tried to compensate by working faster, more decisively. But haste breeds mistakes. A missing key, a mislabeled chemical bottle, a receipt that didn't match the date on the ledger. Tiny inconsistencies, but once noticed, they cannot be unseen. For the first time, the castle was no longer his ally. It had started to work against him. Miles away, in a quiet office lined with case files, Detective Frank Geyer sat alone, reading a simple report. A missing woman, last seen renting a room at the castle. He set the report aside. Then another file, a different name, same address, and then a third. Geyer leaned back in silence, eyes tracing the pattern no one else had bothered to connect. Different victims, different dates, but all leading to a single place and a single man. He didn't say a word. He simply opened a fresh notebook, wrote one name at the top, H. Holmes, and underlined it, slowly. From that moment, every question he asked, every lead he followed, was anchored to that name. Not yet a suspect, not yet a monster, just a shadow, moving quietly behind 3 missing lives. But Geyer had already made a decision. He would follow that shadow until it stood in the light. At first, Geyer had almost nothing to work with. No body, no confession, no solid witness. So he did something simple. He started listening. A receptionist from the castle said she once heard a scream, soft but sharp, like someone trying not to be heard. A coal delivery man remembered Holmes ordering fuel, far more often than any other building on the block. Must be cold in there, he joked at the time. The way he said it now carried no humor. And then there was the maid. She never looked Geyer in the eye, only at the floor, as she whispered about a locked room down the southwest corridor. No one had the key, except Holmes. Sometimes, she swore she heard movement inside when no one was supposed to be in there. Single statements, small details, none of them enough on their own. But together, they began to form the outline of something terribly real. Holmes felt it long before anyone said a word. A presence, almost invisible, pressing against the back of his neck. The castle didn't feel obedient anymore. It felt like it was listening. So he did the only thing he still trusted. He forged reality. New contracts appeared overnight. Accounts were updated. Insurance policies rewritten with names that didn't belong to anyone. Not anymore. But the ink dried wrong. One banker ran his finger across the page, paused, and frowned. This signature looks identical to the last one. Another clerk stared at a document for too long, realizing the date was 3 days in the future. Word spread in hushed conversations behind closed doors. Something is off about him. Holmes doubled down, worked faster, lied harder. But with every new falsified page, another small thread unraveled. Debt, rumors, unanswered questions, all tightening around him, like a rope drawn slowly through gloved hands. For the first time in his life, Holmes wasn't controlling the story. He was trapped inside it. Holmes stepped out of the pharmacy, coat drawn tight against the night air. Street lamps flickered. Horse car wheels hissed across wet cobblestones. And there, across the street, a figure stood in absolute stillness. Half of his face swallowed by gaslight, the other half lost in shadow. He didn't move, didn't smoke, didn't speak, just watched. Holmes paused mid-step, pulse tightening against his collar. The man blinked, once, then disappeared behind a passing carriage. That should have been the end of it, but the next evening, different street, different crowd, same pose, same silence, same eyes. Holmes kept walking, but his pace quickened, as though the street behind him had suddenly gotten closer. By the time he reached his rented room, He slammed the lock twice, then turned off every light, except a small oil lamp on the dresser. All night he sat in the dark, facing the door, breathing quietly, waiting. No footsteps, no knock, just the faint impression that someone, somewhere, was standing right outside the door and simply refusing to leave. Holmes didn't announce his departure. He simply walked out of the castle one morning, carrying nothing but a small leather valise and a folded overcoat. No goodbyes, no explanation. The castle watched him go, its windows blank and unblinking, as though it already knew he would never return. He boarded a northbound train without hesitation, but as the wheels began to roll, he kept his eyes on the platform. No one was chasing him, yet he watched as if expecting to see a shape step out of the fog at the last possible second. Chicago disappeared behind him. St. Louis rose from the smoke of the rails, then blurred and passed. Texas, Denver, Cincinnati. He changed names as often as other men changed shirts, leaving a different signature in every hotel ledger, a different lie at every front desk. But the further he ran, the more that shadow seemed to follow. A reflection in a bar window, a silhouette in the crowd near the ticket booth. Familiar, unmistakable. Holmes knew what that meant. He wasn't escaping. He was being herded. Holmes arrived in Philadelphia under another false name and was soon seen in the company of three small children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard Peitzel. To neighbors, they looked like a quiet family traveling together. The children held his hands, called him Mr. Pratt. They had no reason to distrust him. Their father had trusted him once, too. For a few weeks, Holmes kept up the illusion, renting adjoining hotel rooms, buying the children sweets, reading them stories at night. Then one morning, Alice and Nellie were gone. Hotel staff remembered seeing the girls the night before, but no one saw them leave. Holmes checked out, alone. Days later, he arrived in a different city, this time with only Howard. Again, he introduced himself as Mr. Pratt. Again, he smiled politely. And again, the child disappeared. Holmes moved on. No luggage, no companions, only a faint, invisible trail of missing children, and a growing suspicion that someone, finally, had begun to follow it. In the pale glow of a desk lamp, Detective Geyer unfolded the letter, slowly, as if it might bleed. "Dear Mother, we are safe. Mr. Pratt is taking good care of us." The handwriting was small, almost childlike, a gentle tone, full of comfort. Geyer let the page rest on his fingers and stared at the postmark, St. Louis. He reached for a second letter. Same voice, different city, Cincinnati. The edges of the paper trembled slightly between his hands. He opened the third. Without reading the words, he checked the postmark first, Philadelphia. A long silence filled the room. Geyer didn't blink. Slowly, he reached over and pulled a folded map across the desk. One by one, he placed the letters along the rail route Holmes had traveled, each one pretending to come from somewhere else. Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Philadelphia. 4 letters, 4 lies. They weren't keeping the family calm. They were buying time. Geyer exhaled, once, through clenched teeth. The children were not writing to their mother. They were already gone. And Holmes was somewhere ahead in the darkness. Geyer spread the letters across the desk, then added hotel ledgers, witness statements, and train schedules, each one a tiny, incomplete fragment. At first, the page looked chaotic. Too many dates, names, places. But then, a path began to form. Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Philadelphia. Each city aligned perfectly. Each disappearance followed the next like links in a chain. Geyer moved his finger along the map, slowly, not tracing the route of a traveler, but the wake of a predator. Along that line, he marked small red circles: Alice, Nellie, Howard. He stared at the 3 names and felt a hollow tightness settle in his chest. This wasn't a man escorting children. It was a man eliminating witnesses one by one, and always, before anyone realized they were missing. Geyer closed his notebook, stood up in silence, and reached for his coat. There was no time left to wait. Holmes was still moving, and the next disappearance could happen tonight. Holmes arrived in Indianapolis just before sunrise, his coat dusted with soot from the overnight train. He checked into a modest hotel under the name Henry Gordon, smiling, polite, confident, as he always was. But something had changed. When the clerk handed him the registration book, Holmes signed too quickly, leaving a faint ink blot at the end of his name. The clerk paused, glanced at the stain, then at Holmes, who looked away a little too fast. Later that day, Holmes walked into a pharmacy and bought several bottles of chemicals. The cashier noticed one label was misprinted, chloroform, spelled with an extra E. Holmes barely looked at it. He took the bottle anyway. A delivery man remembered him paying in cash, but forgetting to take his change. Individually, harmless, but Geyer, now only one day behind, would see them for what they were: stress fractures in a perfectly engineered facade. Holmes wasn't just running anymore, he was slipping. The first call came from a hotel maid in Cincinnati. She told the police about a man with cold eyes who stayed only one night and left the bed sheets stained with something dark. She hadn't reported it before. She was afraid. But now, names were being printed in the newspapers. Investigators were asking questions. And people, finally, started answering. A bellhop in Indianapolis said the man refused help with his luggage, a heavy leather trunk he dragged down the hallway himself, always keeping it between him and anyone else. The bellhop swore he saw a faint scratch, like a fingernail mark, along the brass latch. A nurse recalled passing him in a corridor and catching a strange metallic smell drifting from under a closed door, a smell she had only ever encountered in the hospital morgue. None of them had spoken before, but each story added a new weight to the growing case file, a pattern woven out of brief encounters, fleeting impressions, small moments that now felt terrifyingly clear. Holmes had always relied on silence. Now, silence was turning against him. By now, Geyer no longer needed maps. He could feel the direction Holmes was taking, like following the pull of a storm. Every witness statement, every railway ticket, placed Holmes just one step ahead. In Indianapolis, Geyer arrived 12 hours after Holmes checked out. The clerk still remembered the way he moved, calm, deliberate, like a man who already knew exactly where he was going. In Cincinnati, the bellhop described the heavy trunk. In St. Louis, a porter recalled a man who never turned his back to anyone. Geyer listened to all of it, in silence. Then, without removing his coat, he walked straight back to the station and purchased the next available ticket to Philadelphia. Night fell as the train pulled away. Geyer sat by the window, watching the empty fields slide past like dark water. He didn't eat, he didn't sleep. There was no doubt left. Holmes was still moving, and if Geyer was even a few hours too late, someone else would disappear before morning. Dawn hadn't fully broken when the train slowed into Philadelphia. The sky hung low and colorless, fog coiling between the iron pillars of the station like pale smoke. Geyer stepped onto the platform, coat collar pulled high, eyes scanning every face. Commuters drifted past him, porters shouted, steam hissed over the rails, but beneath the ordinary noise was something else, a stillness, a sense that, somewhere in the crowd, something was out of place. Then, between two rows of passengers disembarking from another train, Geyer saw him. A tall figure in a long gray coat, hat brim pulled low, walking in the opposite direction of everyone else. He didn't run, didn't hide. He moved as though this moment had already been decided. Geyer didn't call out. He simply began to follow, slow, careful steps, closing the distance one heartbeat at a time. Geyer followed at a measured distance, boots striking the stone just softly enough to blend with the morning crowd. Holmes never looked back. He walked with the calm of a man returning home, hands in his coat pockets, head slightly bowed, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. They turned down a narrow side street, fog clinging to the brick walls like a thin veil. A milk cart rattled past. A church bell rang somewhere far away. Holmes slowed. For the briefest moment, Geyer thought he might run. Instead, Holmes stopped beside a small boarding house and reached into his pocket as though searching for a key. Geyer stepped forward, hand hovering over his revolver, closing the last few feet. The street seemed to hold its breath. One step, another. Holmes still didn't turn. It was in that stillness, that space between two heartbeats, that Geyer made his decision. Geyer closed the final step and laid a firm hand on Holmes's shoulder. Holmes froze. For a long, silent second, neither man moved. A distant train whistle cut through the morning fog, and somewhere behind them a carriage wheel skidded over cobblestone. Slowly, Holmes turned his head. There was no surprise in his eyes, no fear, only a quiet recognition, as though he had been expecting this moment for a very long time. Geyer snapped the handcuffs into place, the metal locking with a dry, final click. Holmes breathed in, once, and then smiled. Not wide, not frantic, just a small, deliberate curve of the lips, calm, composed, as if the chains on his wrist were simply another part of the plan. Crowds filled the courthouse corridors, eager to glimpse the man the newspapers had branded the arch-fiend, the devil of Chicago. But when he appeared, it was not what they expected. Not a raving madman, not a trembling monster. Before them stood a gentleman. A dark suit, pressed sharp, hair neatly combed, a polite smile resting on his lips. H. Holmes did not bow his head. He did not avert his eyes. He walked with the composure of a businessman arriving for a meeting, as though this trial were nothing more than another stage, and he, the lead actor. In a chamber crowded with reporters and the curious public, Holmes introduced himself, not as a murderer, but as a man of society. And from the very first moment, he turned the courtroom into a performance. The courtroom was overflowing. Reporters pressed into every corner, pencils ready to carve each word into tomorrow's headlines. For months, the stories of the murder castle had spread like fire. Whispers of vanished guests, doors that locked from the outside, corridors that led nowhere. Chicago's nightmare had become the nation's obsession. But the crowd wasn't here only for justice. They came for something darker, to see the man behind the headlines, to measure him with their own eyes, to ask if evil could truly wear the mask of a gentleman. Every seat was filled, every gaze fixed on him. This was not just a trial, it was a spectacle. And in the hushed air of that crowded chamber, H. Holmes became more than a defendant. He became a performance for the entire nation. Holmes chose to defend himself. He spoke with ease, clear, calculated, the cadence of a practiced lawyer, not a man on trial for murder. His voice was gentle, measured, every phrase delivered with the calm rhythm of someone explaining a contract, not a confession. And when he smiled, it was polite, reassuring, the kind of smile meant to inspire trust. But in that crowded chamber, the effect was unsettling. Reporters exchanged uneasy glances, jurors shifted in their seats. Even the judge paused to watch him more closely. Because there was no fear in H. Holmes, no anger, no desperation, only composure, only charm, as if he were not standing in a courtroom at all, but performing on a stage of his own design. The prosecution called its witnesses. First came a former employee of the castle. He spoke of midnight shifts, of rooms sealed tight, and the sound of screams that no one ever answered. Then, a neighbor took the stand. She remembered hearing cries in the night, sharp, sudden, cut short, as if someone had been silenced mid-breath. And then, a builder, a man who had helped install the doors. Heavy oak frames that locked only from the outside. He admitted he had wondered, even then, what they were truly meant for. Piece by piece, testimony by testimony, a wall began to rise in that courtroom. A wall built not of bricks, but of voices, each one placing another stone into the structure of Holmes's guilt. Then came the papers. The letters Holmes had sent to the Peitzel family, reassuring them their loved ones were safe, were exposed as forgeries. The postmarks, false. The handwriting, undeniably his own. Next came the records, ledgers filled with false entries, bills unpaid, receipts doctored, contracts signed with names that never existed. Piece after piece, the prosecution laid them out before the jury, a network of lies, an empire of paper designed to deceive. What had once looked like clever business dealings now revealed themselves for what they truly were, a trail of fraud leading straight to murder. And with every forged letter, every crooked receipt, the cage around Holmes grew tighter, not built of iron, but of evidence, cold, unforgiving. Even as the evidence mounted, Holmes smiled. He adjusted his tie, as though he were preparing for dinner, not standing trial for murder. When witnesses spoke against him, he nodded politely. When documents exposed his frauds, he leaned back, composed, as if each revelation was simply another line in a play, and he, the actor delivering it. Reporters described his calm as chilling. Jurors noted the absence of fear, no trembling hands, no breaking voice. Holmes seemed to welcome the performance, to embrace it. For him, death was not the end of control. It was another act, another stage. And with every polite smile, he reminded the courtroom that even in chains, he would decide how the story was told. From his cell, Holmes wrote an article. In it, he claimed to have killed 27 people. The public was horrified. Headlines screamed, crowds whispered, and for a moment, it seemed the mask had finally slipped. But as investigators examined the details, things didn't add up. Some names belonged to people still alive. Other claims had no supporting evidence. Historians began to suspect exaggeration, perhaps even fabrication. Was Holmes boasting to secure his own legend, or confessing to crimes still hidden? No one knew for certain, and perhaps no one ever will. Because in the end, Holmes's greatest trick was never just the murders. It was the myth, the mystery, the deliberate distortion of truth. And with one article, he blurred the line between fact and fear. The jury did not take long, less than an hour. Their decision was unanimous: death by hanging. When the words were spoken, the room fell silent. Reporters leaned forward. Spectators held their breath. All eyes turned to Holmes. And yet, there was no protest, no cry of innocence, no plea for mercy. Holmes simply nodded, once, calmly, as if he had expected this outcome all along, as if the verdict was not a sentence, but the closing line of a script he himself had written. Even in judgment, he remained composed, unbroken, and to those who watched, it was not justice they felt. It was the eerie realization that Holmes seemed ready for his final act. May 7th, 1896, Philadelphia. Outside the walls of Moyamensing prison, thousands gathered. Men, women, children, all waiting to witness the end of America's first serial killer. The air was heavy. Vendors sold newspapers. Reporters clutched their notebooks, ready to describe every last detail. Some in the crowd whispered prayers. Others whispered rumors. But all eyes turned toward the prison gates. Inside, the scene was quiet. Holmes walked steadily to the gallows. No struggle, no hesitation. His face, calm, almost serene. He offered no last words, no confession, no plea for forgiveness. Step by step, he climbed the wooden stairs, each footfall echoing through the chamber like the slow toll of a funeral bell. And when he reached the platform, H. Holmes stood tall, not as a broken man, but as though he were ready to meet his final audience. The noose tightened. The crowd outside held its breath. Inside the chamber, Holmes did not struggle. He did not cry out. Instead, he smiled. It was not wide, not frantic, but small, deliberate, the calm curve of lips that seemed almost polite. Reporters later wrote that Holmes died as a gentleman and as a fiend, a composure that unsettled even the hardened witnesses. The rope strained, the silence stretched, until at last, his body fell still. Yet even in death, the image lingered, that quiet smile, that mask of control, as if to remind the world that H. Holmes would choose how his story ended. Not the jury, not the executioner, not the crowd, Holmes himself. And with that final smile, he became more than a man. He became a legend of evil. Death was not the end of his control. Holmes left instructions for his burial. His body would be placed in a coffin of wood and then sealed in cement. Concrete poured heavy, layer after layer, until the box became a block of stone. No surgeon could cut him open. No grave robber could steal his bones. No showman could display his corpse for profit. Even in death, Holmes dictated the terms. Even in death, he clung to control. Witnesses whispered that he feared not hell, but humiliation, that his last obsession was secrecy. And so the coffin sank into the earth, unopened, untouched. Holmes had chosen his ending, and even from the grave, he would keep the final word. But death did not end the story. Years later, whispers began to spread. Some claimed Holmes had faked his execution, that the man who swung from the gallows was not him at all, that another body had taken his place. Others insisted he had bribed his way to freedom, that he walked the earth again under yet another name, and that somewhere, in some quiet town, Holmes still hunted. The rumors multiplied, each darker than the last. Sightings, strange deaths, shadows said to match his face. Historians dismissed the stories, but the public could not let go, because the idea of Holmes alive was more terrifying than Holmes dead. And so the whispers grew into legend, a legend that made certain that H. Holmes would never truly rest in the grave. In 1895, fire swept through the murder castle. Flames licked the walls, windows shattered, the night sky glowed with smoke. Some said it was arson, others called it justice. But when the embers cooled, the castle still stood, scarred, broken, but not yet gone. Soon after, the wreckage was torn down, brick by brick, room by room, until nothing remained but an empty lot. And yet, the building never truly vanished, because in the minds of Chicago's people, it still loomed. Hallways that twisted into silence, doors that locked from the outside, rooms that swallowed guests who never returned. They called it the house that never gave back its tenants, a place that survived, not in stone and timber, but in memory and in fear. Holmes did not remain only in the courtroom or in the grave. He lived on in stories. The newspapers that once called him the arch-fiend soon turned him into a headline that never faded. Writers took his name and shaped it into myth. Novelists imagined his castle. Historians dissected his crimes. Filmmakers borrowed his shadows to create nightmares on screen. And in the study of criminal psychology, Holmes became a case study, a phantom at the crossroads of science and horror. Proof that beneath the glitter of a modern city, monsters could still be born. To Chicago, he was a wound. To America, he was a warning. To the world, he became something larger. Not just a man, but a symbol. A ghost of modernity, reminding us that progress and prosperity can still conceal evil. Holmes did not vanish with history. He became a lesson. In classrooms of psychology and criminal law, his case is still taught. Students study the calm mask he wore, the charm he used to disarm suspicion, the precision with which he manipulated trust. He is often cited in the language of psychiatry as the embodiment of the mask of sanity, a man who appeared ordinary, respectable, even admirable, while beneath the surface, he concealed a predator. Forensic psychologists still turn to Holmes to understand the mind of the psychopath. Cold, detached, calculating. He showed the world that true danger may not snarl or shout. It may shake your hand. It may smile at you. It may look just like anyone else. Holmes is gone, his body buried, his castle reduced to rubble. But the name, H. Holmes, endures, not as a man, not as a memory, but as a warning. He reminds us that evil does not always roar. It does not always bare its teeth. Sometimes it is quiet, polite, smiling. Holmes wore the mask of respectability, a businessman, a doctor, a gentleman, and behind it, he concealed a labyrinth of cruelty. That mask is his true legacy, because it shows us something timeless, something terrifying, that the darkest monsters can look just like men, and that sometimes the devil himself does not scream. He smiles.